Hey everyone and welcome back. In today's video, we will be discussing about the Splunk bucket lifecycle. Now, we already know from the previous video that Splunk basically stores all of its data in directories, and that directory in technical term, it is referred as the buckets. Now, a bucket basically it moves through several stages as it ages. Now, these stages are primarily hot, warm, cold, and frozen. So let me give you one example. So let's say that typically if you do searching in Splunk, you might want to search from last 3 days or from last 7 days. Typically people will not search for data like from last 1 year, right? If you want to search from data from last 1 year, that is something which very few queries will have such requirement. And this is the reason why Splunk will store the data depending upon its age, so that the older data, it might be 1 year older or whatever you specify, it goes into disk which is least expensive, because generally the data which needs to be searched or which analysts would be searching quite frequently, it needs to be in a much more faster disk. Otherwise, there will be a lot of performance impact. So what Splunk does is any data which generally is tend to be searched, it stores it in hot and warm bucket primarily, and then you can move it to cold bucket, which can be a different hard disk altogether. However, the data which is in the cold bucket, it has little amount of chance of it being searched. And the last is the frozen bucket. So this is the overview about why Splunk basically moves the data into several stages depending upon the age as well as various different factors. Now, coming about the bucket lifecycle, you primarily have hot, warm, cold, frozen, and thawed. Now, hot is basically any new data that is being actively written to Splunk, or any most recent data, it gets stored within the hot bucket. Now, data gets rolled from hot to warm, and a warm bucket are generally where no writing is allowed. So one important point to remember is that anything that you write, it only goes into the hot bucket. Once the data goes into the warm bucket, it cannot be written to. All right. So hot is read plus write. Warm, cold, and others are only read only. So you cannot write here. Now, once data goes from hot to warm, we know that data is not actively written to warm buckets. Now, after warm, it goes to cold. All right. So data gets rolled from warm bucket to cold bucket. Now the data which is there in the cold bucket, the chances of it being searched by the analyst is little less. So generally it gets rolled depending upon its age or whatever configuration policy that you define. Now from cold, it goes to frozen. Now frozen data are generally deleted by default unless and until you tell Splunk to not delete it or store it somewhere else. Now from if you archive it, let's say you tell Splunk not to delete the frozen data, you archive it, and if you want to restore the archive back to Splunk, that process is called as thawing. Now one important part to remember is that typically in an organization which has compliance, they do not delete the data for compliance reasons. So they might store the data for 1 year or even for 5 years. And for this reason, typically frozen data will not be deleted. So you'll have to explicitly tell Splunk not to delete the data which goes into frozen and archive it instead. Now, this is a nice little diagram for the bucket life cycle so that we can understand. So any events that comes into Splunk, it goes into the hot bucket. Now, once the hot bucket is full, it goes into the warm bucket. Now, typically hot and warm bucket are in the same hard disk drive. So you see, they are typically in the same disk. Now, from warm bucket, it goes into the cold bucket. Now cold bucket, you see, it typically is a cheaper storage. Now, whatever disk you have in hot and warm bucket, it needs to be very fast. Otherwise, you will have a lot of performance impact. And this is the reason why the requirement of disk IOPS or various other disk related performance matrix is very high. Again, depending upon the data volume for hot and warm bucket. However, you can have a little slower disk for the data which is there in the cold bucket. Now, once data from cold bucket, it goes to frozen bucket. Now, a frozen bucket, so any data which goes to frozen, it is deleted by default. You can specify a frozen path so that the data can be archived, and then you have the third path. So third part is you put the archived data and you do the restoration process so that it is again searchable in Splunk. So this is the high level overview about the bucket lifecycle. So this is the theoretical perspective. Now before we continue with more slides, again it will be more theoretical, let's do practical and let's look into how exactly this would look like. So what we'll do is we'll go to settings and we'll select indexes. Alright, so these are various indexes, and if you see, each index here has its own max size. It tells how many events are currently present within the index, what is the earlier event, what is the latest event, the path, and also the frozen path. Do remember that if you do not really specify frozen path, the data by default, as we know, it will get deleted. So now let's go ahead and we'll create a new index. So we'll give this index name as Bucket Lifecycle so that we can relate it to our video. And the maximum size of index you can specify in MB, GB or TB. Now I'll select 4 MB so that we can actually test on how exactly this works. And that's about it. So this is the simple configuration that we'll do with our video. I'll click on save. Now once you have saved it, you will see that you have a new index called as Bucket Lifecycle, and the maximum size is of 4 MB. We have not really specified any frozen path here, and this is the path where our directory lies or where our bucket lies. So let's go to the CLI and then understand it better. So I'm in my CLI, and if you do a OPT Splunk, we'll do a etc, and we are looking for a file called as indexes.conf. So if you typically do a find command, I'll say indexes.conf. There are various indexes.conf. Now we are more interested in the indexes.conf, which is present within the search and reporting app that we have created. So we'll go to apps, we'll go to search, we'll go to local, and within local you have indexes.conf. Now this indexes.conf, so this is the bucket that we have created. Now again, there are two ways. You can either do it through GUI, CLI, or even directly through configuration. So there are 3 ways here. Now each of this index over here has its associated configuration path. So this is a field value pair. So cold path is a key, and this is the path where the cold data will be stored. We already discussed here that cold data can be stored in a cheaper storage, and this is the reason why, in case you have multiple disks and one disk is little cheaper, you can specify the path of that disk over here. And along with that, there are various other configuration parameter. One important one is the max total data size MB is equal to 4. So this is one important configuration path. So this is it about the indexes.conf. Now if we go to opt splunk var lib Splunk, we already know that our bucket will be stored here. The bucket name is Bucket Lifecycle. I'll go to Bucket Lifecycle, and within this you have the cold DB here. Again, we'll be discussing this, and if you do a DB here, only thing that you have currently is the creation time. So DB directory is where your hot and warm buckets will be stored. Cold DB, we already know this is where the cold data will be stored, and frozen is something that gets deleted by default. So currently, since we do not have any data, you just have the creation time. So now let's do one thing. Let's go ahead and add some data to our bucket lifecycle index. So for our test purpose, what I have done is I have selected a file. So this file is of size 4.06 MB. So this is the file that we have selected. So this is this file, and we'll do a next. The source type is access combined, and the index this time we'll give bucket lifecycle. We'll do a review and we'll click on submit. Perfect. So now if we do start searching, we have a total of 13,000 events. Now once you have this, let's go to the indexes once again. And currently, if you look into the bucket lifecycle events, you will see that the current size is of 3 MB. So 3 MB of data has been indexed. Now the question is how 3 MB, because we actually uploaded a 4.2 MB of data and it is showing 3 MB. So now in order to understand this, if I do a ls-l, you see now you have a hot bucket created. So this hot bucket we already discussed. So any new data or any data which is actively written to, it gets stored within the hot bucket. So if I do a hot 1.0, and here you have the tsidx file and you have the raw data. Within raw data, you see you have the journal.gz file. So what Splunk has done is Splunk has compressed the data. So Splunk actively does lot of compression of raw data, and this is why our size of index is much more lesser than the file which was uploaded, because it is compressed. Now one important part, in fact that is in the next slide that we have, is when will the data from hot bucket go to the warm bucket. Again, this is an important pointer to understand. So there are certain conditions as follows where the data will be pushed from hot bucket to warm bucket. First is when we have too many hot buckets, which is basically defined with max hot buckets parameter within the indexes.conf. That is the first. Second is hot bucket has not received data since a while. Then is time span of the bucket is too large. Then is bucket metadata files have grown large. You have index clustering replication error, and one more is Splunk is restarted. So these are the factors through which the data from hot bucket gets rolled to the warm bucket. So let's look into one important aspect here. We'll do a Splunk is restarted and we'll see on how exactly it would work. So what I'll do is I'll do opt Splunk bin Splunk restart. So we'll manually restart Splunk and see how the data gets rolled from the hot to warm bucket. Alright, so Splunk is now restarted. So if you quickly go to opt Splunk var lib Splunk bucket lifecycle, then we'll go to, let's go inside here. If you do ls, we'll go inside the db. Remember, db is the directory where hot and warm buckets will be stored. So now if you go into db, now you see whatever bucket which was present, hot underscore v1, it got changed into db underscore. These are the identifiers. So now this is what is referred as the warm bucket. Now once warm bucket is present, this is where new data will not be stored. This is just the read-only data, and hence it is also possible to back up the data. Do remember that data within hot bucket cannot be backed up and should not be backed up, only the warm bucket. So if you want to back up data, you need to roll it from hot bucket to warm bucket, and then only you can go ahead and back up your data. So let's do some interesting thing so that we understand it in a much more better way. So now that we have restarted, I'll just have to log in, and these are what our logs were earlier. So now let's do one thing. I'll create a directory in the root. I'll say mkdir /backup. All right, so let me do a sudo. Now once we have the backup directory, we will move the entire warm bucket that we have to the backup directory. So now let's move the db underscore and we'll move it to the backup directory. We'll have to do a sudo here. All right. Now once you have moved it, if you go back to the Splunk and let's do a search again, now you see you have 0 events. The reason why you have 0 events is because the entire warm bucket is now moved to a different directory altogether, and Splunk does not really have access to it. So this is something about backup. So you can safely, ideally you should not be doing move, but you can do something like copy and copy it into your backup drive. It can be AWS S3, which most of the organization typically they back up the data into. So let's quickly get our data. I'll just put it here with the sudo. All right. So now we have our warm bucket yet again. So if I do a quick search, our events are backup. Now along with that, one interesting thing that I wanted to show you is typically if you go inside the warm bucket, the data that you will see inside the raw data, everything will be in a compressed manner. So you see you have journal.gz, and typically this is the compressed data that you have here. You will not have data like earlier we saw that in raw data, like in the previous video, the data was we were able to do a cat on the file directly. However, once the data moves to the warm bucket, it will typically get stored in a compressed manner. So this is it about moving the data from hot bucket to warm bucket. We'll continue with this series in the upcoming video. Otherwise, the length of the video will go quite long. So with this, we'll conclude this video. I hope this has been informative for you, and I look forward to see you in the next video.